And best-selling author Tom Standage has a new book out, and it's called Writing on the Wall. Tom Standage, what do Cicero and Twitter have in common?
Well, the idea of the book is that social media is a very old idea. We think that it's recent and that only people alive today have ever done it. But really what I'm arguing is that there's a very long and rich tradition of social media that goes back, in fact, to the era of Cicero, the late Roman Republic. So that's the 1st century BC. And the point is that you don't need a digital network to do social media. If you have one, it goes faster, but you could actually do it in the old days. So Cicero did it with papyrus rolls and messengers running to and fro, and other members of the Roman elite were all linked to him, and they all spoke to each other, and it was very much a social environment. But there are then many other examples that occur throughout history. Martin Luther and his use of pamphlets, poetry in the Tudor court of Anne Boleyn, Tom Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense, and the way that pamphlets were used more broadly in the run-up to the American and the French revolutions. So there are many, many examples, and really what I'm arguing is that when we use social media today, it's a reversion actually to the way media operated for centuries before us.
You write that for wealthy Romans, the distinction between letter writing and conversation was further blurred by the custom of dictating outgoing letters to scribes and having incoming letters read aloud to them.
Indeed. So if you were someone like Cicero or Julius Caesar, you would have a scribe. In fact, Caesar was famous for being able to dictate 2 letters at once. So you would be dictating letters to them. Then you would also have a staff of messengers who would be carrying these messages to your friends. And then when incoming messengers brought a scroll, your scribe would perhaps read it out to you. I mean, Romans like Cicero and Caesar were capable of reading and writing, but they got more done. They had higher bandwidth if they used scribes. And in fact, the role played by scribes and messengers, both of whom were slaves most of the time, is akin to the role that broadband plays for us today. The reason we can do social media on the scale we can is that it's very cheap and fast to copy and deliver information. And for the Romans, it was also cheap and fast because they had slavery. It was cheaper and faster than it had been before, and the Romans were a relatively literate society. So they were able to have this sort of social media ecosystem where they all passed messages to each other, sometimes several times a day, and it looks very familiar to people who use Twitter and Facebook today.
What were the wax tablets that you talk about?
Yeah, so the Romans had these devices which look extraordinarily like modern iPads or smartphones. And so if you were sending a message within the city of Rome, then rather than using a piece of papyrus, you might use a wax tablet, which was reusable. So it was a wooden frame and it had wax in the middle, and you would scratch your message, or your scribe would do it for you, using a stylus, and then you would send this message by messenger across the city, and the recipient would write their answer underneath, and then it would be brought back to you. And Cicero refers to this. It was sort of Roman texting, and it was also used as a notepad, and people learnt to write using these things. So they look really astonishingly like iPads. They're exactly the same size and shape as a modern iPad. There's even a sort of 1-inch wide frame around the outside. And there are also quite a lot of examples of Roman murals where people are depicted holding what look like, frankly, smartphones, or those little smartphones that use styluses to write on. And this is because they're using these very small wax tablets as notebooks. And so it's one of these other unexpected connections between the way we do things today and the way the Romans did it 2,000 years ago.
And Tom Standage, you talk about the fact that the Romans had their own LOLs, their own shorthand.
They did. They also used They used abbreviations because they had, not much space to write on these wax tablets or on a single piece of papyrus. And if you wanted to write a longer letter, you could glue several pieces of papyrus together. But by and large, it was easier just to use one. So there was a premium on space, just as there is with a text message today or a tweet. So they used abbreviations. So one of them would be SPD, and that was sends greetings to. And there was another abbreviation that essentially meant I'm well, I hope you're well, and if you are, that makes me happy. And you would just say that in 4 or 5 letters, and then you could get on with the actual important part of the message. So it's very similar to the way we use abbreviations, BTW, LOL, and so on in tweets and in text today.
Martin Luther, you write that Luther had unwittingly revealed the power of a decentralized person-to-person media system whose participants took care of distribution.
So Luther is very interesting. He is obviously 15 centuries after Cicero, But initially what he does looks quite Roman. So Luther is a theologian in the town of Wittenberg, and he thinks that the Catholic Church has got it wrong on the doctrine of indulgences. The Church is essentially selling these bits of paper that get you out of purgatory earlier than you otherwise have to after you die. And they're selling these things to raise money to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And Luther thinks this is a bit dodgy. This is fleecing the poor of their savings in order to build this great big temple to the church. And so he thinks this is unacceptable, and he draws up a list of reasons why he disagrees with it, 95 of them, in Latin, and he says, let's have a debate about this. Here are the things I think we should debate. And he pins this to the door of the church in Wittenberg, and that's how you announce a debate. The church door was the university notice board, and people read them and go, wow, this is hot stuff. So they start copying them down and sending them to their friends and discussing them, and so far, so Roman. This is the same sort of thing. It's manuscript transmission of Latin text. But since the Roman period, Gutenberg has invented the printing press, and a couple of printers get hold of this list, and they go, wow, this is dynamite. People want to hear about this. So they print 1,000 copies each, and those 1,000 copies are taken to other towns, and printers there print their own copies. And so the theses, the list of 95 reasons that things that Luther wants to debate, they spread throughout the whole of Germany within 2 weeks. And they spread throughout the whole of Western Europe within 4 weeks. This is absolutely astonishing. Luther is amazed by this, so is everybody else. But Luther senses an opportunity. He realizes that if he wants to take his message of reform to the public, he can have his message distributed in this way without really having to do very much. So he follows up with a series of pamphlets written in German rather than Latin, because that way more people will be able to understand them. And he writes in a very sort of straightforward German, so that people in different parts of the German-speaking lands with different dialects will still be able to understand him. And he gives the text to the printer in his town directly. No money changes hands. He just says, here you go. The printer prints 1,000 copies. They go to nearby towns. The printers there go, oh, it's another one from Luther. They print another 1,000 copies each, and so on and so on. And it ripples. And Luther does this for several years. He wages this campaign using pamphlets and preaching and other, and woodcuts and other things as well. But essentially, he's using the fact that the printers and the audience are collectively amplifying his message because they're interested in what he has to say. They're handling the distribution for him. They're recommending it to their friends. And if you have a message that people are interested in, that people want to hear, that people want to recommend to their friends, then you can get this kind of viral spread. And we recognize that today on the internet. But that was what Martin Luther took advantage of in the 1520s, and the result was the split in the church, the Reformation.
Now, Mr. Standage, how does that differ, what Martin Luther was doing, from mass media?
Well, the difference is that when you have a social media system, whether it's today on the internet or whether it's in the old days using pamphlets or papyrus, a social media system is a two-way conversational environment in which people are passing stuff directly to and from their friends. So you're exchanging information along social networks. And that's why we call it social networking and social media. And this creates a distributed discussion or community. So that's what a social environment looks like. And we're familiar with that on Facebook and Twitter, where we basically get stuff, we see stuff from people that we've followed. So it's along a social network. The difference with mass media is that mass media is one way, and it's impersonal, and it's basically top-down broadcast. So the radio, for example, sits in the corner of the room. It's not social. It's just sitting there. You're not having a conversation with it, and there is no social networking, personal recommendation involved. And so we have come to think of these one-way mass media channels, which can reach a very large audience very efficiently. So newspapers, radio, TV. We've come to think of them as old media, as the way media always was. And that the rise of the internet and social media is a change, and it's unprecedented. And now we can get news from our friends, and you don't need to be a newspaper editor or the head of a TV channel to decide what message is going to spread. But actually, this is how things worked in the era before mass media. Mass media is a very recent invention. It really only gets going in the second half of the 19th century, so after the 1850s, and we've come to see that period as the way media always was. But if you look before that, the period before old media, what I call the period of really old media, then actually it looks very, very familiar. It's social. It's social right the way from the Romans all the way up to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and it's only after that that we get mass media. And so the thesis of the book is that social media is a reversion to the way things used to be, and that therefore we can learn from the old social media systems that came before. It turns out that many of the questions we have about social media today, it's